Okay. Good evening, everybody. Good Tavach. Hanukkah is behind us. Can you believe you're already in 2025? Anyway, let's make this correct. So we're now in the 2024-2025 lecture series. It's entitled A New Century But No Peace, State of Israel and Jewish People 2000 to 2004. Tonight is lecture number 9 out of 12. So we're getting there slowly but surely. The title, of course, is The Jews in Europe and the British Commonwealth in the New Century. That was a title 7 or 8 months ago. We're going to see where it meanders today. It'll be roughly in that area. And as you can see, it says a deep sponsorship tonight by Herman and Sherry Berlin, dedicated to Sherry's nephew and nephew-in-law and the IDF. Okay? May Hashem keep all the soldiers safe, bring all the hostages home, grant a swift and speedy recovery to all those who are wounded and traumatized. May Hashem watch over all the children of Israel become orphans since the war began. They're right, they touched every dot. As usual, we want to thank Shomer Amuna for hosting us tonight. Next week they're having another affair at the same time, but that doesn't interfere with us. At least I hope it doesn't. We want to thank, of course, the Lehmann family back from Israel, right? Florida. Next guess. Second guess. The third is Panama these days, you know. For being the series sponsor and all of our individual sponsors, of course, and the tech team, of course, who are on top of everything and able to start fairly close to schedule today. So without any further ado, since Jimmy Carter died this past week, I thought it'd just be interesting to see the pictures. Here's when he won, here's when he lost. Okay? And by the way, when he won, it was a solid South. That's the last time that's happened for the Democrats. Okay? Of course, he ran as a Southerner. I remember his speaking in the South and saying, wouldn't it be great to have a president who spoke without an accent for a change? Which was true. But of course, this kind of reflects the fact that he wasn't so popular the second time. Right? Now, the news is trying to build him up and so on and so forth. I get that. I understand that. But, and you can't say beating a dead horse, that's not a nice thing to say. But nevertheless, let's put it this way, the voters voted with their feet. Because that's pretty bad for an incumbent.
You got Maryland.
Right? That's right. Well, that proves my point. Right. That proves my... Well, there used to be a thing called yellow dog Democrats in the South. It's a famous expression. The yellow dog Democrat meant he'll vote... This is in the old days of segregation. The yellow dog Democrat means he'll vote for anybody who's a Democrat and take it, even a yellow dog.
Oh.
You see him? So that's Maryland. Anyway, but to get to our topic today, European Jewry, shall we say, Western European Jewry, British, and the others, though, like I said before, the titles I come up with, I have to come like a year ahead. And the way things develop, I don't know about you, once you start writing, the words take on a life of their own. Many times I've written a story intending it to go this way, and the characters ended up drawing me that way. That's how it goes. The golden age of European Jewry, in a political sense, was the 3 decades after World War II, 45 to 75. That's when it was good to be a Jew in Europe, if I can use that expression. It is true the European Jewry at that time was bloodied and bruised after the Holocaust, of course. And to a certain extent, it was understandably traumatized. These were the survivors, or the people who just escaped Hitler by the skin of their teeth, right? So every country in Europe, just about, was under the Germans, except the British, of course, and some tiny communities, Sweden, Switzerland. But everybody else was traumatized, and many of the survivors and relatives were, coming to these countries, and therefore there was a period of trauma. It's also true that the Jews in the communist countries in those years had it bad. So this story today does not involve the Iron Curtain states. Remember the old Iron Curtain, the red part over here? There's nothing positive report about being a Jew in Poland or Czechoslovakia or Hungary or Romania and all that stuff in 45, 55, 65, and 75 and so forth. That's just, it's tough. They went through Hitler, then they had to go through the communists. 45 years of that junk. Okay? By the way, with plenty of anti-Semitism, right? Just of a different type. But in the Western European countries, the Holocaust had made anti-Semitism illegitimate, beyond the pale, in an unprecedented way. Here's Eisenhower talking about a bunch of skulls. I mean, these are dead Jews, okay? And what did he say? He said, no one will believe this one day. And if you go to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., they have on the wall outside where Eisenhower said they should make pictures and everything over here because somebody will wonder he's a Holocaust denier. They'll just say it's not true. You and I live in a great era of denial. The narrative is forming as we speak. The October 7th didn't happen. Nobody was raped, nobody was burned, nobody was killed. Maybe some people were killed in a military attack, but it's all highly civilized and all the rest of it. And you see a lie being constructed in front of your eyes, right? But it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter. Because people will believe what they want to believe. It has nothing to do with the objective of it. Maybe in mathematics, maybe in the hard sciences, it's hard to make a case like that. Although Stalin tried, if you remember, with the genetics. But nevertheless, in the non-hard sciences, it's easy to make any kind of narrative you want. We see that unfolding before our eyes. But it's an interesting period, in other words, for the historian. Even the good old mild anti-Semitism, a traditional and constitutive element in European and Christian civilization, because it always had been part of European civilization, the anti-Semitism in one form or another. After all, if you are a Christian, you have ties with the Jews. Why didn't you accept Jesus? Simple as that. According to some versions, why'd you kill him? That's a constitutive element of European culture. You understand? So even the anti-Semitism, which had never involved actual harm to Jews, was now, in the years after the Second World War in Western Europe, conflated with Hitler and Nazism. So it became very unfashionable to say, I don't like people with long noses, I don't like people who do this guy Jewed me down and all the rest of it, even though it was natural to the way they talk. And to be fair about it, the Jews had their share of prejudice also, right? So nobody's perfect in this. Now, anti-Semitism in Western Europe did not disappear, but it went sub rosa, went underground. So in other words, it's like people talk politics today, right? They're afraid to say anything out in public, most people, but among their friends, they'll say this, that, and the other, and they'll make all kind of statements, right or wrong, religious slurs, ethnic slurs, things like that. That's what happened with anti-Semitism in Europe in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And at official levels, anti-Semitism was denounced in public institutions, schools, and universities. So in other words, you just couldn't be politically correct. The kind of thing we have now, you have right-wing parties emerging in some of these countries, some of which, now not all the right-wing parties are anti-Semitic. Many people try to conflate that also. That's the same thing as saying Trump's an anti-Semite. There's a certain left-wing thing where they say anybody on the right is anti-Semitic. But there are distinctly anti-Semitic parties. And some of them get traction now. They didn't get traction in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. You see, in 70s. They didn't get traction. So it's interesting. So the new generation is growing up in Europe. England, France, Germany, the Netherlands, places like that, Italy, educated after the war, were brainwashed as much as possible away from anti-Semitism. And this is what you learned in school. So Anne Frank is the poster girl for what I'm talking about. Everybody knew what happened to Anne Frank. And everybody knew what a tragedy is and all the rest of it. So how can you be against Anne Frank? You get it? And therefore, by extension, how can you be against, the Jews? But here things got tricky. There was enough of the old anti-Semitism left because, I repeat, it's a constitutive element of European culture. People just don't know that part of being European is to be Christian, and that's a very, very important part of being European. Maybe we understand it today a little bit better in contradistinction to Islam, okay? Maybe Americans aren't aware of this. I don't know. That's the reason I'm sharing this with you. So there was enough left of the old anti-Semitism that the new anti-Semitism after the Second World War in Western Europe was not condemned directly in culture, rather was included in the general anti-racist narrative. I think that's interesting. So people didn't say, public figures didn't say, it's bad to be against Jews and treat Jews well and this and that and the other. It's a little bit too hard to say that. Maybe in Germany was a little bit of an exception because of the Lehmann money and the idea that the Western German state did come out and say, listen, we did it, and we have to apologize for it and all that sort of thing. You got to give them credit for that, even though it wasn't popular at the popular level. But in France, let's say, in Italy, in other countries where bad stuff had happened to Jews, again, I'm confining my remarks to Western Europe, you didn't come out and say things positive about the Jews. You said it's wrong to be prejudiced against anyone. That's how you located it, with a universalistic kind of narrative. Anti-racism, it's interesting, developed after the Second World War as a natural result of the experience of Nazism, which discredited European racialism by demonstrating the genocidal working out of racialism to its logical conclusion. Now, there's racialism and racism. It's not so easy to pull apart the terms. But racialism, as I've said many times, was universal in Europe in the 19th century, and in this country, by the way, in a way to try to understand the different peoples that are out there in the world, because the human race is very diverse in terms of racialist categories, which don't have to necessarily do with the color of your skin. Of course, people of different color are different races, but I'm talking about white on white racism, for example, or racialism. So there's a difference depending how you spin this. Northern Europeans are substantially different than South Europeans. Western are substantially different than East Europeans. Even within countries, people in northern France are farther away from the Mediterranean, so they're more hardworking. People in the south are close to the Mediterranean, they're more la la la. None of this is true, you understand? But there's enough truth in it that people really believe in it, okay? And let alone people in the Muslim world, the African world, the Asian world, and all the rest of it. Now, by the way, it's not a European disease. Every group has this way of thinking about other people, okay? In Africa, they're going to divide white people in different types also. And the Chinese are going to divide everybody in different groups also. And it will affect how they conduct their affairs, which is interesting because it's not scientific, but it's close enough to scientific in their opinion that they regard it as practical and therefore scientific. So racialism was this way. That doesn't mean I do something wrong to you. Racist means I do something wrong to you in one way or another. I implement it. I'll explain more as we go on. In the modern era, let's say from 1800 to 1930, anti-Semitism, because I'm talking about Jews specifically, especially tonight, I would say wore two hats. Anti-Semitism wore two hats. Number one, it was part of a general European racialism, which was all the rage in the 19th century, as you can see. I'm talking about racialism as opposed to racism. Everybody felt this way. This racialism was a certain byproduct of the fact that Europe, and only Europe, had discovered science and technology in the 19th century. The other continents did not. That's just a fact, right? The United States of America is part of Europe. We're European colonists. But not the Indians. You see what I'm saying? Not the peoples in South America, the non-European ones. This is just a fact. The others did not discover science, technology in the 19th century on their own, okay? The Europeans brought it with them in one way or another. This experience of being introduced to science, technology through foreigners who usually come in dominating situations, they call it colonialism. You get it? As a cultural phenomenon. Anyway, the bottom line is the Europeans were therefore militarily superior. The others were military inferior. The others didn't have modern cannon and guns and all that kind of stuff. They didn't. As a result, Europe conquered the world, and rather easily. All those colors that you see in the map are territories owned by European countries. So I could name 7 or 8 countries own most of the world. England, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, US, Spain. Between those 7 countries, they own gigantic, vast territories of the world. I mean, the whole India, look at Asia. And China was almost conquered. So just about everything else was taken over by someone else. Look at the map of Africa. Look at the map of, in Latin America was dominated by the United States, what they call dollar diplomacy, get it? That's why they call banana republics in those days. So the Europeans did this because they had the kayak. Right? They had the gunboats, the others didn't. They had the cannon, the others didn't. Now, the Europeans, how did they regard this phenomenon? That we, a small island like England, now own the whole entire Indian Empire, which is India and Pakistan and Malaya and Burma and all this and that and the other, and whole continents, Australia, the whole North America is English or, from English stock. And the Japanese were latecomers, but they started doing it too. So why is this so? Why did it happen that Europe became scientifically light years ahead of everybody else? Light years ahead. So why are the others militarily inferior? Must be because they're culturally inferior. You understand? Now, this is an interesting argument. Let's put it this way. What is it that led, for example, the Arabs, not to participate in everything I just spoke about? The scientific and technological stuff. There are cultural factors. What about the witch doctor in Cucamonga? There are cultural factors. What about the Chinese? As great as they had once been, there are cultural factors. Does that mean you're inferior culturally? How do you exactly define? You see what I'm saying? It's not pashut. Why were they but to Europeans it was pashut, right? Why were they culturally inferior? Because they're racially inferior. You see, genetically inferior. This is the conclusion they came to. That's not true, but that's the conclusion they came to. You and I know it's not true. They were always one education away from being just as knowledgeable and skilled as anyone else. Go to college and talk to any of the Asian students there, and they're ahead of everybody else. Okay, you're just one education away. But culture is a factor. It's very controversial. Why do you have these dictators in the Middle East and Africa and places like that? Why don't you have dictators like this in Europe? You did before the modern era, you see. What about Hitler, though? Well, that's an anomaly. Is that an anomaly? These are good bull sessions for, the seminars. They really are. They really are. It's a complex question. So where do Jews fit in all this? Viewing Jews in European eyes as racially inferior made sense to Europeans in the 19th century. Look at the Jews, how they look. They look from another planet, from hundreds of years ago. They're primitive. They're behind. Must be there's something in the Jewish genes that keeps them behind. But then again, what about the Nobel Prize winners? Right? What do you do with that? You see, it doesn't make any sense to them. I'm talking about the 19th century. It doesn't make sense. Where do you get this? Where do you get that? And the answer, of course, is it's just one education away. Right? You could be, the modern history is replete with people who, for example, grew up in frum families, had no secular education, then did, and went on to become Nobel Prize winners or similar sorts of things. The better racialists indeed viewed the Jews as culturally inferior, but definitely redeemable as full members of European culture and even progress. So you talk about Teddy Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, if you read their writings, they're very racialist, okay? But they like Jews, right? And I think, because the Jewish old stuff, that's just a generation away. Listen, in the time 100 years ago, you come to America, within a little while, you or your children are fully American and up to speed with all the modern science and technology. You get it? And no harm done. So Churchill liked Jews, and Roosevelt liked Jews, even though they're very racially minded, okay? Indeed, they were Philo-Semites. You see? So it doesn't mean that you view everybody that we're all equal. That has nothing to do with being a Philo-Semite. By the way, the Zionist argument, which arose in this era, Herzl was 1890s and afterwards, the Zionist argument, which arose in this era, was an argument to European racialists, who were the dominant features in the culture. The Zionist argument was one of safety. The Zionist argument was the Jews are an education and a country away from being normal. What did Herzl say? We're not normal. We are weird. We're obnoxious. All that is true. But it can be fixed if we modernize and get a country. You see? The Jewish situation is abnormal. Therefore, Jews are not normal. If you normalize them, they'll become normal. That's the argument. To non-racialist Westerners, the Zionist argument is one of safety. People don't like Joe Biden Because he said, I remember he said right after October 8th, if Israel don't exist, the Jews are toast, it won't be safe. Right? So that's a Zionist argument. And he said openly, I'm a Zionist. I mean, he believes that the Jews need Israel to be safe. Let me be more clear about that. He means the Jews in America need Israel to be safe in America. Okay? Now, by the way, he's bitterly attacked, not only by the usual suspects, but by the Jewish leftists, the Jewish Voice for Peace, and all those type of groups. You're president of the United States. You shouldn't say that. You're responsible for our safety, regardless. I get that, but I understand what he's saying, which is say whatever you want, but you need Israel. So you see, Zionism rose in the context of racialism as a kind of response. So European anti-Semitism in the modern era was always partly racialist. But you and I know anti-Semitism in Europe existed long before racialism started, long before the 1800s. It was pre-racialist, because Christian culture had always demonized the Jews because of what they did to Jesus, belief, disbelief, killing, not killing, all those sorts of things. In other words, it was religious and theological, and as such had been woven over centuries as part of the warp and woof of European culture, the European negotiation of the world around them. Okay? So notice, let's go to the next one. This is Trachtenberg's famous book. This is in the City Hall in Frankfurt and places like that. The Jews as demons. That's from the 1500s, 1400s. Has nothing to do with modern in terms of racial and all the rest of it. But the Jews are viewed as demonic in some sense or another because they were the other. They were, after all, in the period I'm talking about, the only non-Christian group in Europe. Okay? England, France, Germany, Italy, those kind of places. There was nothing but Christians and a few Jews. And you can understand over the course of time, that could develop into intense hatred of the one group that's not like you. As you and I know, demonization, by the way, if you look in the Haggadah in the Chumash, Vayareu lanu hamitzrim, Vayareu osanu hamitzrim bayanunu. It's a famous part that in Dvarim, when they recall the Vidui Bikurim, I think, they recall the history of the Jewish people, Arami Ovid Avi, Vayir Mitzrayim, that we went to Egypt and all that business. Vayareu osanu hamitzrim bayanunu. Doesn't say Vayareu lanu, it says Vayareu osanu. Right? So, osanu means a direct object. In other words, they were ra to us. So the 19th century Mefarshim, maybe earlier, will say the Egyptians demonized us before they enslaved us. By a so they made us ra. In other words, they ascribed to us all kind of evils. And only then, when the atmosphere was sufficiently poisoned, could they implement the slavery. I associate with 19th century commentators, which would be within the context of racialism, wouldn't it? But anyway, demonization assumed, as you and I know, extreme forms. Otherwise, you would never get the blood libel and wouldn't get the traction that it has, right? So this is a major part of European art, in famous churches and places like that, in Trent, and other places. In other words, at some level or another, listen to what I'm saying, some level or another, most Christians do believe the blood libel in some way, okay? So much so that, it's very rare for one to say, that's total baloney. And rather they'll say, I don't believe it, but. Need I remind you what happened in New York, in Long Island, right? In Mineola, in 1924, in this country, when some kid was missing or somebody was missing, and the chief of police and the mayor went to the rabbi, a reform rabbi, and said what happened to him. Okay? Now, once it got in the papers and all that, but I'm just saying, it wasn't considered crazy. You understand? We all know. So I'm trying to tell you that part of the culture is anti-Jewish. Okay? Now I repeat, part of the Jewish culture is the same, but whatever. The Christian religion had always been part of the European education system. You understand? Secular public schools like you have today is recent. Throughout history, and even in the modern era for a long time. Look, how long ago did you have Bible readings in this country? Right? The Catholic schools started in this country because he said the public schools are all Protestant, which was true. Now, not formally, but informally, you can get a lot across. So the Christian religion had always been part of the European education system. And as such, they had to teach the anti-Jewish stuff at one level or another. In other words, explicitly or implicitly. But in post-war Europe, several megatrends kicked in, such as the weakening of religion bichlal, under the twin blows of materialism and skepticism, which identifies religion with credulity. This really took off after 1945. Slowly but surely, not immediately, but slowly but surely, which is why Christianity is unbelievably anemic today in Europe. Very few go to church, things like that. If this is going to change, and it may very well start to change, it'll only be in reaction, a defensive reaction against the Muslim immigrants. You see? People may rediscover their Christian roots. You see? But on its own, it was withering. Interesting, Japan also, I understand the religion is out 2% go to whatever the temple is. So this was an era of a weakening of classic religion in the West. And also, there was a not great showing of religion in World War II. I mean, the Catholic Church did buddy up to some degree with Hitler. You understand? That's a fact. And of course, there was, after 1945 especially, the religious dynamism of Marxism. Okay? The 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, you still have plenty of real believers. Okay? Real believers in Marxism. And even after Khrushchev denounced Stalin in 1956, and even after the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, you still had real believers. I would say communism started to fall apart as a belief in the 70s and the 80s. 70s and 80s. You know, Solzhenitsyn and all this stuff, so when people actually went to Russia and visited and saw what's going on, it ain't no communist paradise. But a lot of people, including a lot of Yidden, okay, went on. I spoke once about Shimon Abramsky, Abramsky's son, who was one of the number 2 or 3 in the British Communist Party. And come from very rabbinic background, all the rest of it. They continued to be believers like until the late 60s or something like that. That was long after Khrushchev had exposed Stalinism for what it was. So it's you understand, when you get into belief in something, you can't give it up. Or sometimes you can't give it up. I understand it. Happened to Shabtai Tzvi stuff. Anyhow, and of course the powerful Marxist critique of Christianity, where Marx says the opiate of the masses. It's to help the employers, okay? So these megatrends had nothing to do specifically with Jews, materialism, skepticism, all the rest of it, but the Jews were unintended beneficiaries because it meant that the culture was less Christian. They were less religious and more secular, and at that time that meant that you're not going to have the same kind of theologically grounded bad feelings about Jews that you formerly had. That's what it boils down to. We're past that, especially among the younger generations. The surveys in those years always used to bring out the same thing. Who dislikes the Jews? 50 and over, or something like that. 50 and younger, 40 and younger had different results. Because 50 and older is still from the old Europe. Okay? In fact, we used to say, back in the 70s, 80s, once the older generation in Europe dies out, anti-Semitism will be gone. You see? I get it. Listen, the past is always changing. Now, 1945 to 1975 also saw unprecedented prosperity at the mass level. And this too weakened anti-Semitism. So thanks to the Marshall Plan and things like that, when this country poured a wealth of money into Europe to help them build up, and the Marshall Plan in Western Europe was successful, okay? You look at the numbers, they had 10, 15% growth rates a year. You know what I said? In the late 40s and 50s. Europe, after 1945, became more prosperous than it ever was in history. And the prosperity hit more people at the ground level, the bottom level, than ever before in history. Right? I mean, the average person out there, the worker, and all the others, enjoyed a lifestyle vastly superior to any of their predecessors. With the modern social welfare state, free health, education, welfare, which you got over there, and the vacations and all the rest of it. I mean, they never had it so good. Now, they didn't have it. They were not as economically successful as the American workers, but compared to the old English workers, or the old French workers, or the old Belgian workers and so forth, they were Italian workers, Greek workers, they were much farther ahead. You see, much farther ahead. In general, when you're doing well, you're not so anti-Semitic. Okay? That's not always true, but there's a lot of people for whom that's true. One of the ways anti-Semitism flourished in Europe was in the poverty of the masses. This point was always made by the Marxists. Marx and Lenin, the others, they say anti-Semitism is a function of the fact of capitalist exploitation, et cetera, et cetera. But once, and that's partially true. Now, it's not as simple as that, okay? Those Jews who became communists thought it's as simple as that. So, believing as they did in the truth of communist, economics and philosophies, they thought once you get rid of the economic problems, there'll be no more racial hatred. You and I know that that's not true, but I'm talking about what happened in those years. So it's interesting. Finally, Jews, for the most part, in Western Europe, were conformists to European culture. You see? The Jews acculturated and assimilated, especially after 1945. And they were white. Okay? Herein lies another tale. The tale of non-European immigration into Europe. I said that Europe conquered the rest of the world thanks to the European superiority in science and weapons. And that's true. As a result, and here's the paradox, the unintended consequences always kicks in. As a result, European countries who had always been totally white and totally Christian now ruled over millions of non-Europeans who are not white and not Christian. It's unprecedented. Here's the law of unforeseen consequences. The Europeans, having forced their rule on the natives, sometimes through genocide, now not only had the opportunity to economically exploit these territories and natives, but they also had the task of ruling them, which required philosophy. Here's the famous Shlomo Melech problem in Koheles. You won the lottery, they have $1 billion, what do you do with the rest of your life? So you better have some philosophy to guide it, otherwise it'll take you down. Either the golden calf is worshiping you or vice versa. Now, if I rule India and 100 other countries, what do I do with them? What do I do with the people there? So this requires choices. Do you keep them uneducated? Right? Keep them away from technology and things like that? That's not what the Europeans did. They said it'll help everybody around. I don't know if they thought it through exactly, but they provided European education for, if not masses, whole significant groups of the conquered peoples. That's interesting. Paradoxically, while asserting white rule, they had to make their own European countries less white, thanks to the presence of colonized races. So Africans and Asians are now located in London, Rome, Amsterdam, Brussels, Berlin, and other places, thanks to, I'm talking about after 1945, which had never been the case until then. Europe was like lily white, like forever, until the colonialism brought in a small stream and then an increasing stream of people who are not lily white, okay? Particularly, this was true because I just described to you, the European colonialism that I described happened in the 1800s, in the 19th century, when Europe became democratic and constitutional. So you couldn't let me do, like they did once upon a time, the Spanish conquistadors. Nobody was looking, just make a genocide. You had to just kill millions of people. And others did in other places. The Russians did it in the Far East. That's what you do, okay? Because if groups won't go along, you just kill them. 19th century is a democratic country. You have newspapers, you have journalists, this stuff comes out, the public is shocked. Best example jumps to my mind right now, Belgian Congo. If you know what they did in the Belgian Congo, it's unbelievable. It's like Hitler, understand? And they chopped everybody's hand off and things like this. It's terrible. right? And they turned the place literally into one giant nightmare, really was, for the exploitation of Belgian and other European capitalist investors. And the king owned the whole business on his own. King Leopold was one of the great villains of history. And it really was just horrible. And then some investigative reporters brought it out. And that led to changes. You get it? Because it's the 19th century, and you have the modern free press, and the public has to say what's going on, and there is some degree of conscience. Okay? So, it's just interesting. The United States, by the way, has an interesting history in this regard. I mean, despite our being a democracy, and we are, the Indians never got citizenship or civil rights, did they? They put in reservations, as you know. They don't vote. I'm talking about in the good old days, so to speak. Here's a famous book by Helen Hunt Jackson, I think in the 1870s. What is it called? The Crime of America, A Century of Dishonor. This is around the 1870s. Yeah, 1876. As to how dishonorably the USA behaved towards the Indian tribes. We live in Maryland. No Indians left over here. You got Indian names. You see? That's what they do in this part of the country. In fact, they do it all over the U.S. They killed out the Indians, they kept the names. Utah, Nevada, Susquehanna, Patapsco, Wicomico, and so forth. Right? All across the country. It's an interesting phenomenon. You got the Philippines. Any lawyers over here know what the insular cases were? It was in the United States Supreme Court in the early 1900s said, Constitution does not apply to the Filipinos or the Puerto Ricans. You see? They're not Americans. Because let's put it this way, even though we're a democracy, but the Constitution is not following the flag. Later, I think in the 50s, I believe, sometime later, the Supreme Court reversed that. Okay? So somebody's in Guam today, for example, has the same rights as anybody else. But it wasn't that way for a long time. As a matter of fact, the election of 1900 was fought exactly between William McKinley and William Jennings Bryan, Bryan being the Democrat, was fought specifically over the question of what I just described. Colonialism, imperialism, is that a policy the U.S. should follow? Look at this. He's saying equal rights for all, special privileges for none. That was a Democratic candidate. And what do they say? The American flag, I can't even read it, has... Read it for me.
Not been planted in foreign soil to acquire more territory, but for humanity's sake.
Yeah, you're right. You believe that? That's when we were killing the Filipinos by the buckets. You understand? So, who won? The imperialists. McKinley, right? Bryan ran 3 times and lost 3 times. So, these issues are not only European. I mean, we have American counterparts. So by 1945, the empire still existed. Africans and Asians were increasingly moving to the home countries, to England, to France, to Belgium, places like that, Netherlands. And a certain guilt over colonialism became politically correct. After Hitler, and anyway, it's very expensive and hard to maintain your rule anymore once there were rebellions in all the colonies. How could they hold on to all these territories? And anyway, it's morally wrong to rule other people. And so, new attitudes kicked in. The Jews are living in this Europe. Sometimes the waters were muddied by the Cold War. So notice, Ho Chi Minh said, I want the French out. Yeah, but we're against it because he's a communist. You understand? Or Nasser said, I want the British out. Yeah, but he's too friends with Russia. So the questions of communism, non-communism, I remember in my youth, and so do some of you, there's always questions, should America favor the nationalistic powers or the colonialist powers? It wasn't simple, you understand? And we really got messed up in the Vietnam War, didn't we? We really got messed up, in which we intervened in strange ways. But the empires of Britain and France and Holland and Italy and Belgium disintegrated in the 20 years after the Second World War. The European countries endeavored to quit in a responsible manner and with an implied admission of guilt for having ruled them. By responsible, I mean in such a manner that the European countries could continue to have good relations with the former colonies for a whole bunch of reasons. They didn't want the Russians to take over the Cold War. Economics, we want to still trade with those countries. European investors still own mines and other things like that now. Who owns all the real estate now in the third world countries? China. Okay? Bottom line is, the new Europe welcomed Africans and Asians from their former colonies into the home countries, which for the first time started to have large and growing minorities. So Europe, which had been lily white and Christian, starts in the period I'm talking about to be not so much so. Okay? Already by the 1950s, it was political suicide to oppose such immigration. I have the famous case of Enoch Powell in England, who was a famous politician, very brilliant, and clearly would have become prime minister, but he was against the immigration of Indians and Africans, and this is ruining our country. I'm saying, everybody, like Donald Trump, so to speak, you know what I mean? I'm saying everybody knows. In the 50s, he was dumped. You understand? In addition, Europe after 1945 had ZPG, zero population growth. Notice the fashion to have small families really kicked in into Western Europe. It went along with the social welfare state. My mother had 9 children. She had a terrible life. You know, she worked like a dog, and then she died. And so I'm not going to do that. Right? I belong to a union. I have benefits, and I'll have 1 kid or 2. It's like that. So not only does this affect European demography, but it led to a consequent dependence on immigration to maintain the economy, which is what a lot of countries are facing at this moment. I'm sure you must know, even though it sounds funny to say it, China has a population problem. Why? Because it's like that. Everybody has 1 child or 2 childs. That's what they pushed for decades. And they're getting older, and there's not enough young to pay for the Social Security, all the older. Okay? So now China's doing the opposite of this thing. Everybody should have 10 children, but it's already hardwired into them not to. And if you're a Chinese woman, as I understand from the press, you've already got this in your mind. Why should I be like the one who had 9 children and worked like a dog? Okay? And not only China, many countries, including, by the way, Iran. Isn't that funny? Including Iran. So, if it happens in Europe, and it's the 1950s and 60s and 70s, what you're saying is like this: we got to bring in people from third world to do the jobs that we don't want to do, and to do the jobs that need to be done. We don't have enough regular European white people to do. Okay, so it's not only the low-class jobs, but even factory jobs. Germany, they call them Gastarbeiter, guest workers. They already started this in the 50s, taken from Turkey. You get it? So, as I said, this was all gradual. And as long as it wasn't large, the Jews were not affected, the Jews in Western Europe. But among the Africans and Asians were many Muslims. How would that affect the Arab-Israeli conflict? How would that affect the Palestinian issue? Well, in the 30 years of 1945 to 75, the relatively few Muslim immigrants were not radicalized. It's interesting, right? They were believers, and they went to mosque and all that. They weren't radicalized. Why were they not radicalized? I'm talking about Islamically radicalized. Because these were the peak years of Arab nationalism, which was about as secular and Western nationalist as Muslims could get. This was the period of Nasser, for example. I told you, Nasser was modern Orthodox. He's Teaneck, okay? And if you see how his wife dressed and all the rest of it, Mamish was Teaneck. And the message was you can be a fully frum Muslim and all the rest of it. You don't have to wear all this stuff and do all this radical business and all the rest of it. You can westernize successfully without losing your own identity, okay? Now, in such a secular nationalist, as opposed to Islamist, context, let's say a Pakistani or a Nigerian would not get so riled up over the defeat of the Six-Day War and the occupation of the West Bank. Because, yes, it happened to Muslims, but I'm Nigerian. I don't have nothing to do with the Arabs. I certainly don't have anything with the Egyptians or the Syrians, right? It was in such a context. What I'm trying to say is like this. Ironically, now, the past is always changing, and our perspective is always changing. in the quote-unquote golden years of Arab nationalism, my youth, the 50s and 60s, 70s, first half of the 70s, it actually was good for Israel because it promoted this discourse of people identifying themselves in secular national terms. And Pakistan and Malaysia and Indonesia, I mean, they're not Arabs. So they're not part of the Arab-Israeli conflict. You understand? It was in this context, for example, that allowed Israel to have excellent relations with Iran and Turkey, which are two Muslim countries, provided there was no Persumi Nisa, correct? If it didn't get too public about it. I told you, there's that book by Professor Podeh about the Mossad-mistress relationship, as I call them. You have a mistress, you don't do it in public. They're behind doors. So Israel was tight with Iran, with Turkey, with Indonesia, by the way, some of these other countries as well, even though they're Muslim countries, but they didn't perceive themselves as being part of the Arab-Israeli conflict. You see? So although there were increasing populations of Muslims, it did not affect the general pro-Israel sentiment in Western countries. Interesting. So generally speaking, the English, the French, the Dutch, and all that were generally pro-Israel. But after the Yom Kippur War and the subsequent events, the oil shortages and so forth, secular nationalism declined. One of the effects of the Yom Kippur War was the exposing of Arab nationalism as hollow. They're not really going to unite all the Arabs, and they can't beat Israel. And the utopia that they're promising is not happening. And instead, all the Arab countries are being taken over by dictatorships, which are only interested in feathering their own nests, which was the truth, okay? I mean, who ruled all the Arab countries? Arab countries. Dictators of one form or another. So it was like a dysfunctional. Here's Europe, and it's running regular, and they have democracy, and they have a good economy. And just across the water is the Arab countries, and it's one little clique after another ruling the place, and exploiting the people under them. So much for the dream of Nasserism. Now, instead, secular nationalism declined and Islamization replaced it. From our perspective today, that's the big story of the last 50 years. Islamization. Instead of me saying, I'm a Nigerian, I'm a Muslim. Instead of me saying, I'm a Algerian immigrant to France, I'm a Muslim immigrant to France. Your primary identity becomes Islamic, okay? You're not denying where you came from, but you start to think in religious terms. If you think in religious terms, if all the Muslims are part of one great ummah, as they call it, then the Arab-Israeli conflict engages their intention and even the passion. You understand? Because wherever Islam is at war, I want to join. It could be against the war against the Russians in Pakistan. It could be somewhere else, kidnapping those ships off the Horn of Africa, Arab-Israeli conflict. Also, by the way, fight the Americans in Iraq. Right? That's what that's all about. ISIS is a relatively late development of that. But I'm talking about the seeds of that. Okay? It was in this atmosphere that the younger generation of Muslims in Europe, as well as youthful immigrants who were Islamically educated in their native countries, began to practice energy and even violence in the European countries. This happened slowly but pretty surely in 1975 to 2000, in the last quarter of the 20th century. Right? I think we didn't want to see it. We tried to ignore it, but it was there. Now, this was bad for Israel. And this was bad for the Jews in Western Europe. And this has been the big story in Jewish history ever since. So by year 2000, thoughtful European Jews were asking themselves, is there a future here? For my grandchildren, at least. Maybe for me, for my kids. Now, the Jews who were asking this were the Jews who felt most comfortable in the UK and in France, etc. These were the ones who had chosen not to make Aliyah, if I'm talking about the 90s and 2000. So, I live in France. What's Israel? It's 3 hours away? It's like going to New York. Okay? I can go there for the weekend or whatever I have. Matter of fact, a lot of these Jews buy apartments in Israel and places like that. And I'm not talking about a place to run away to. You have a second house, right? Some people have a second house in Florida. You got a second house in Israel? Again, it's 3 hours away, 2 hours away, whatever. Okay? They had worked, these Jews I'm talking about, in Europe, Western Europe, had worked out a diaspora identity. Each community in its own specific context. In some places, they were discreetly Jewish. In London and Antwerp, they were heavily Hasidic, as you know. Depending on the local cultural scene, whatever. I mean, this is just interesting. Europe has different countries, different cultures. They have different Jewish communities. In some places, for a whole bunch of reasons that I don't have time to go into tonight, the Jews really assimilated, I mean by that in the acculturation sense. I'm talking about Jews who gave up totally in their Jewish identity. Jews who embraced their Jewish identity, but married it to European identity. The way we all do in America, okay? They worked out identity. Here it's interesting to compare and contrast the two most important European communities that had all the Jews, almost all the Jews, Britain and France. What are the statistics? England started out with a few thousand Jews. By the time you get to 1945, it's 450 with the immigration. Well, let's put it this way. England, as you can see over here, had 6,000 in the 1700s. By 1800, 75, it's a little high actually. And then it jumped to 60. Oh boy, that's the Russia. Here are the Litvaks in 1900, you know what I mean? From 60 to 250, it's a quadruple. That's the 1880s, 1890s, running away from the pogroms. That's what that is, okay? And then eventually went, now England then passed a law, like we had in America, quotas. They said too many Jews coming in. They didn't say it that, but that's what it was. But even so, you had 300. And in the 30s, they did bring, they brought in 50, 60,000 German Jews. Okay, German and Austrian Jews. So they did do that. Anyway, as you can see, very interestingly, zero population growth. The Jews have no babies. Therefore, it goes down and down. Oh, and then the Hasidim kick in. And the Hasidim kick in. I'm serious. That's what happened. England, I'm very serious. It goes down, that's the secular. And then by definition, the secular die out. You have 1 or 2 kids, and when you're gone, you leave very little behind. In Stamford Hill and these other places, they have 5, 10, 15 children. And the numbers in England are actually going up. Rabbi Jacobowitz said this 30 years ago, maybe more. I remember he wrote this. He said, the regular number is going up. From now on, it's going up thanks to the ultra-Orthodox. Okay? That's just an interesting statistic. Because without the Hasidim, what would it be? Half of that, Okay? So, it's just interesting, the population. France has a little bit of a different situation. The French started out, again, without going through too many details, I don't have time tonight. But at the end of the war, you had 300,000, that's a lot. About 100,000 have been killed by Hitler and messed up and things like that, which is a big number. Whoa, what happened? 300,000, it doubled, more than doubled. The North African Jews running away from Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. Okay? It's supposed to be secular nationalism, but the fact is, once they became Arab countries, they'll kill all the Jews until you run away to France. Okay? Israel kept saying, come to us. They said, no, thank you. We'll go to France. Look at this. By 2000, partly because of zero population growth, and partly because of immigration, it went down from 7 to 6. And today, it's like that. The numbers are not 100% clear. It's in that area. It's about 500,000 Jews. Maybe a little less, maybe a tiny bit more. They argue with those figures. That's what you're talking about. So between the two, that's the great, great majority of Western European Jews. How many Jews live in Belgium and Holland and Germany? Germany today is growing. I should have put that in because the Ruskies moved there and some others. So Germany probably has 100,000 Jews. So those are the 3 communities. I should really include those. Other communities besides that are tiny. Now, the UK, which is what I have time for tonight, was always the least anti-Semitic country in Europe, which is an interesting statement. Historically, not in the Middle Ages, but since Oliver Cromwell, let's put it that way. England was always the least anti-Semitic. I didn't say they had no anti-Semitism, I did not say that. but compared to other countries, much less, and more mild, right? You know, someone could call your name, listen, compared to like what you have in Eastern Europe, is garnished, you understand? Now, I didn't say no anti-Semitism, but relatively. That's why, look, Balfour was sort of anti-Semitic. Churchill was sort of anti-Semitic. You know, that's not really. You understand? Not really. And their whole career they helped Jews. Right? You don't need me to tell you that. So that's what I'm talking about, English anti-Semitism. Jews, for the most part, assimilated very heavily in Great Britain. By the late 20th century, they had reached the top in every area of Jewish life, just like it had in America. Right? It's interesting, the top positions. This was particularly evident under Margaret Thatcher, who appointed many Jews to the highest ministerial posts in her governments, and John Majors, foreign minister, defense minister, treasury minister, the top jobs, including some observant Jews. I remember Rifkin and the other guys, they were, traditional Jews, let's put it that way. And in addition, Margaret Thatcher was a chassid of Jacobowitz. That's a fact. You see? She wrote back to him, he wrote back to her. They admired each other. That's just the way it was. These were testimonies to Jewry, who, by the way, Jacobowitz was the Orthodox chief rabbi. Okay? And publicly so. So I have a British prime minister who kind of fawned. Well, by the way, Margaret Thatcher was the MP for Finchley. That's Park Heights in London, right? Golders Green and Finchley, you know. So, her constituency was, I remember reading in one of in her autobiography many years ago, she said, in England you always start the campaign season on Friday, but not in my district. I wait till Monday. But she didn't mean nothing bad about it. You get what I'm saying? These were testimonies to Jewry's successful integration into British life without even having to give up Jewish observance, which had not been the case once upon a time. In order to get ahead in a European country, you had to sort of give up being Torah mitzvahs, let's put it that way. In the Israelis' time, you had to give up being Jewish by religion. But afterwards, you had to blend in. And then after that, Jonathan Sacks took everything to the next level, right? Because we used to think Jacobowitz has it in. And Jonathan Sacks took it in an unprecedented way. You'll see in a second. So by 2000, when we were starting, the prime minister was Tony Blair, Labour Party, who was not only a chassid of Jonathan Sacks, he was a talmid of Jonathan Sacks. You think I'm kidding? Watch this.
For me, Jonathan was a teacher. We often used to discuss the Bible together. And I would recall in my youth and through hundreds, thousands maybe of church services over the years, I'd read the books of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy and the whole tale of the Jews going from Egypt to the Promised Land. And what Jonathan did for me was he gave those things that were stories I was familiar with, he gave them meaning. And he gave them meaning to me in the life that I was leading. So he would explain to me how it wasn't just the story, the journey, but it was about leadership, about leading and being led, about governing and being governed, about hope and despair and vision and struggle, about faith, about a covenant broken and a covenant restored, about wickedness and about redemption. And through that, he taught me how the wretched weakness of humanity is so clear when absent from God, and when united with God, that extraordinary potential for human achievement. So he ended up, in part, giving me a sense of my own religious tradition and an understanding of other religious traditions, but most of all, he gave me a feeling of why it was important to have faith and how faith was central to human progress. So, we know he's been taken from us far, far too young. But when I think of all the things that he taught me, and when I think of the difference he made to my life and to the lives of so many others, it's an extraordinary legacy and a wonderful example to those of us who remain. And I know that the things that he gave me as a teacher, as a true rabbi, they will remain with me until the day I die. And in some small way, I try and then pass on some of those lessons to those who come after me. This is the greatest testament to a human life there can possibly be.
Now, let's get this straight. He was learning with him when he was the Prime Minister of Great Britain. You know what I'm saying? Now, this happened when he's the top of the chain. Right? It's not, that, like I met him when he was young and later became Prime Minister. So, I'll say it again, no rabbi, in fact, probably no Jew, had this kind of cachet. And it's in the year 2000. I'll say Tony Blair is like 1995 to 2006, something like that. Okay? And so while all this is going on, I know nobody knew this. Okay? But first of all, we're not British. I think in England they knew it. And he was a speaker in the other thing. But it's more than that. Look at the next one. You have other tributes from the King of England.
I'm sorry I can't be with you today.
That's David Cameron, the Prime Minister.
The whole country. I want to say a very special thank you for 22 years of incredible service as Chief Rabbi. When you were in Downing Street a few weeks ago, I introduced you to Prime Minister Netanyahu, and without thinking, I described you as my rabbi. It was a symbol of the impact that you had on this country far beyond the Jewish community. Because over the past 2 decades, you have been not just a leader for Jewish people, but for all of us. You've challenged us to stand up for the place of religion in modern society. You've promoted the importance of ethics and responsibility, providing not just a religious voice, but frankly a moral voice in our country too. And you played a huge part in improving interfaith relations, teaching the dignity of difference and the power of what faith communities can achieve when they work together. For me personally, your book, The Home We Build Together, had a significant influence on my own mission to build a bigger and stronger society right here in Britain, something that I believe can transcend the divide of party politics. So thank you for the very special contribution you made to the Jewish community and to our whole country.
I particularly appreciate the Chief Rabbi's identification of covenantal relationships between us, which are so creative and are so different from political relationships and economical market relationships. And it's that area of covenantal agreement and cooperation between us for the common good which is so important and which will be part of his lasting legacy. Lord Sachs, we thank you for so much that you have done, but especially in this area of interfaith relations and your relationships with the Catholic Church. Thank you very much indeed.
So how do you sum up someone who
This is Prime Minister Gordon Brown.
The greatest philosopher you know, the greatest writer you know, one of the greatest thinkers in the world. It's this, that he was always and has always been ahead of his time. He saw that there had to be somewhere between markets and state with his politics of hope long before anybody else did. He saw there had to be a response to 9/11, and he did so with great eloquence in his book. He saw that the ethics of markets were an issue long before the financial crisis. And he saw that we had to answer these great debates about science and religion, and has led the way in doing so. But the one thing in addition to that is he always told me, he gave me this great advice: you can only get your views across and explain what you're doing by telling stories. And he's also one of the greatest storytellers I've ever met.
You have been an amazing intellectual communicator
and a unifier. In these three dimensions of your work, you've been simply outstanding, and I want to thank you for the way you've been able to combine a generosity of spirit with your commitment to Orthodox Judaism.
I'm so sorry that I'm not able to be with you this evening for what sounds like a very special event. Certainly I think it's a very justified one for the enormous contribution you've made for more than 20 years to public life in the UK and of course predominantly to your own faith. Over that time, you and Elaine have become an established part of the lives of very many people. What you've done over that period, I think, has been very profound. Many people have benefited from it, and very few people will forget the enormous contribution that you've made. I don't only, of course, refer to your public life, but also to many private kindnesses and to your remarkable output in books. As a student of your books over many years, you've absorbed more hours of my time than I can possibly remember, but they've been hours very well spent in my judgment. So thank you very much for all you've done for our country and for your faith. Whatever you may do in the future, and it's hard to think you will be retired in the accepted sense of the word, but whatever you and Elaine do in the future, I wish you every happiness and every success to have a truly wonderful evening.
You've been, of course, as
I think we could stop it. You get the general idea. Like, you didn't get Prince Charles at that time. You never had that before. Now, mind you, we could use somebody like this right now in Europe. Okay? This is a sorely missed. Again, especially the time I'm talking about, the 2000s, the early 2000s, the British royal family, let's put it this way, the Queen of England, if you know, never was very particularly interested in Jews. I don't mean anything bad by it, but her husband took that up, Prince Philip. And that's taken over by the son, Prince Charles, now the king. And he's the one with the yarmulke all the time. He always goes to Jewish affairs. And here you have Prince Charles at that time coming in when Sachs retires and the new guy comes in, Ephraim Mervis, the current chief rabbi, and they have a big fancy in some big shul in London, all the rest of it, with a choir and so on and so forth. And then, Rabbi Sachs gives his last speech, and then the new one gives the new speech. I only have a clip of it, but to show you, and Prince Charles is sitting right there. Let's go see this.
Looking around the synagogue right now, I'm so touched to see so many of you who have made great efforts to come and celebrate with us today from many countries right around the world. But first and foremost, Your Royal Highness, your presence today is a great honor. Not just an honor for me personally, but a great honor for our entire community. It is a reflection of the passion you have to work with the faith communities in this country. It is an expression of your desire to bring unity and to promote all the good things that we stand for. Your input and your inspiration go a long way. May I avail of this opportunity on behalf of all present, and indeed on behalf of our entire community, to warmly congratulate you on the recent birth of your first grandchild, His Royal Highness Prince George Alexander Louis of Cambridge. Mazel tov.
Yeah, so you get the idea. Let me put it this way. So among the Christians, I think the Jews had successfully located themselves. As for the Arab-Israeli conflict, there was a minority of leftists always who were stridently anti-Israel, but not the majority. And even the leftists in those days had to clarify that they were not anti-Jewish. Okay? Indeed, not that long ago, when Jeremy Corbyn ran a few years ago as the head of the Labour Party, and it was clear that he was indeed anti-Jewish, except for radical anti-Israel Jews, that's okay, but everything else not. The Labour Party had a big defeat. Okay? And I remember very well, it was right, by the way, it was right around Hanukkah time, and Boris Johnson, who won, immediately put out like a little video to the Jewish community.
All our Jewish friends, neighbours and relatives, wherever you are in the world, let me wish you a very happy Hanukkah. And there's every reason to be happy at this time of year. After all, quite aside from the joys of latkes and donuts, I had the pleasure of baking a few myself when I visited Golders Green during the election campaign. Who can argue with a festival where the kids get presents every day for more than a week? And it's time to celebrate not just the miracle of the oil, but also your unique identity. To pop the Hanukkah menorah in the window and say to the world, just as Judah and his small band of poorly equipped Maccabees said to Antiochus III and his mighty Greek army all those years ago, I am Jewish and I'm proud of it. And that's really important right now. Because I know that recent years have not been easy ones for British Jews. In the media, on the streets, and particularly online, anti-Semites have in alarming numbers been emboldened to crawl out from under their rocks and begin once again to spread their brand of noxious hatred far and wide. But as you kindle the Hanukkah light tonight, and in the nights to come, I want you to remember this. When the Maccabees drove the forces of darkness out of Jerusalem, they had to do so on their own. Today, as Britain's Jews seek to drive back the darkness of resurgent anti-Semitism, you have every decent person in this country fighting by your side. Because Britain would not be Britain without a Jewish community. And we will stand with you and celebrate with you at Hanukkah and all year round. Have Hanukkah Sameach.
Now, in his way, wait a minute, not so funny. Look at the difference between the way they talked in 2000 and the way they talked in 2019, when this was done. Already there's references to the resurgent anti-Semitism. You understand? Already there's references to the fact that you're under attack, but the good people are with you. That bespeaks the transformations happened in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. Okay? Already the growing Muslim population was becoming religiously radicalized, and it was politically incorrect to call for ending Muslim immigration. Indeed, the Jews, as always, were liberal on this subject, just as they're liberal in this country, even though it's against their own physical safety. Right? They're against any kind of laws saying you can't bring in, they should stop the immigration over here, even though these people are coming to kill you. It's typically Jewish. Right? There's always a Jewish mishigas against voting against your own interest in the unspoken hope that it will be appreciated. This is the Jewish voting patterns. Maybe we'll do this next week. A certain mentality. In the particular time frame of 2000, 2004, Muslims in Great Britain and elsewhere in Europe were focused not so much on Israel as on the USA, the UK, and the West, in quotes. Remember, this was the age of the rhetoric about the great Satan. Right? Osama bin Laden says first you got to knock out the great Satan, and then you go after Israel, the small one. Indeed, a key element of the radicalization that took place among Muslims in Europe was the disgust with the Arab regimes and the Arab states. I mean, who was in charge in 2000? You had Assad, Jr. and Sr., you had Saddam Hussein, you had Gaddafi, you had Mubarak. These are all, not admirable people, let's put it that way. And so, is this the best you can produce? No, it's because they're not Muslim enough. You get it? They got to be done away with and replaced by the real religious ones. Wanting to overthrow these regimes and on their corpses erect a caliphate. That's what it was the message of Osama bin Laden. Right? Which, as you say, eventually became understood as ISIS, Al-Qaeda. I'll repeat what I just said. They want to get rid of all the Arab states. Algeria should go out of business. Morocco should go out of business. Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia. And it should become just one big empire, one big caliphate. To them, the worst year in this way of thinking, the worst year in recent Arab history was not 1948, when Ben Gurion proclaimed the State of Israel. It was 1919, 1920, when the evil, conniving Europeans carved up the area of the caliphate into distinct secular states. and thereby set one piece of Arabs against the other, which only serves the purposes of the West. That's how they interpret it. Okay? The insidious partitioning of the great Islamic world into these states. So much so insidious was this, that even when the Europeans left, these artificial states continued. Look at the dumb Arabs. This is what the Islamic radicalists say. Look at the dumb Arabs, that they fall for this Arab nationalism thing, and they're Egyptian patriots, and they have anthems for Tunisia and for Syria and all this other kind of business. That's a Western way of thinking, right? The venal Arabs, Saudi Arabians only care about money. You understand? It's that kind of rhetoric. The satanically ingenious fractioning of Islamic power. I repeat, satanically. That what the West did, America, England, France, and so forth, was from the Yetzer Hara, from Satan. Okay? Israel's only a small piece of this problem. You get it? Notice when you think in the terms I just described to you, of course Israel and Palestine's a problem, no question about it. But it's only a piece of a much larger problem. Okay? If the states are done away with, the thinking goes, then Israel disappears. Notice if they become one great caliphate, Israel can't handle that. Really, these radicalized Muslims had contempt for the Palestinian movement. See what I just said? Like for Arafat. It's too narrow. It follows the Western handbook. Watch this. Hold it for a second. This is from the memory. You know what memory is, right? And they have a speech in a mosque, I think in Yerushalayim, by an Islamic preacher, some forth, in which he's saying, to heck with Palestine, we have to go for the Islamic bigger picture, right? And he's making fun of the national anthems. Look at this.
الحقائق تقول أننا نحن لا ننتمي لفلسطين ولا واحد فينا يوم القيامة ينادي منادي ويقول أين الفلسطينيون؟ يدخلوا من باب معين. والجنسية الفلسطينية لا توحد ولا تفرق، وإنما هي بدعة استعمارية وطنية خلقها سايكس وبيكو وقالوا هذا فلسطيني وهذا أردني وهذا جزائري وهذا سوداني، ولا زلنا من 100 عام نعاني من هذه التفرقة على أساس الوطنية، فهي نتنة ورائحتها عفنة، ولكل من يقول أنه في صف فلسطيني فهو واهم ولا يدري كيف تسير الأمور. ما هي هويتنا؟ هويتنا مسلم، نحن مسلمون. الأردن باطلة أكثر، مصر باطلة أكثر، الجزائر اللي راحوا عليها باطلة أكثر، كلها دويلات ضرار قامت على أنقاض الخلافة الإسلامية التي هدمت قبل 100 عام. إذا أقاموا دولة لهم على أرض فلسطين كاملة، تمام؟ كاملة ولا يهودي فيها، يعتبروا ضالين مضلين زي الأردن، زي مصر، زي الجزائر، زي السودان، زي إندونيسيا، زي باكستان. لأنه ما في شيء اسمه دولة فلسطينية، في شيء اسمه إسلام. النظام السياسي في الإسلام خلافة. مسلم يدعو إلى دولة وطنية كارثة. مسلم يقول أنا فلسطيني ودمي فلسطيني ومن دولة فلسطينية. ضايع، تايه. الوطنية ليست من الشريعة. الوطنية من سايكس وبيكو. الوطنية ليست من الإسلام. والوطنية هي انتماء إلى تراب، والنبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لو كان ينتمي إلى تراب لبقي في مكة، فبالتالي الوطنية يا عزيزي والقومية هي مصطلحات بديئة لا تتماشى مع الإسلام، ونحن مسلمون أولا وآخرا. الأرض الإسلامية مساحتها تنبو على 20 مليون كيلو متر مربع. اسمع، 20 مليون كيلو متر مربع، بر غير البحر. فلسطين كلها على بعضها البعض التاريخية 28,000 كيلو متر أو 27,000 كيلو متر مربع. عبد راسنا أوساخ الاستعمار، عبد راسنا. وطن الكويت سلمت للمجد، فلسطيني. الكويت أولا، مصر فوق الجميع. أنا الأردن أردننا يا أردننا يا مش عارف إيش. ذبحتنا فيروز، ذبحتنا مش عارف إيش. أكثر من فاضي. شو اللي براسك أنت وراس المسلمين؟ كلها قد وراس حطوها الكفار وعلى مدى بتهبش هذا الأمة تظهر تنهار.
This is what's being fought now, really, in the Middle East. I don't think most people were. That's why I'm telling you this tonight. And so it sounds funny, almost counterintuitive. You're not in favor of Palestinian state. The ISIS, the people in Syria, for all I know, these other groups, I mean, this is how they're thinking. You know what I'm saying? And like I said before, if they can put all the other pieces together, then Israel's toast. That's the way it thinks. Now, having said this, Hamas is part of this movement. So Hamas really says like this: we want to wipe out Israel, and then we'll join you to make a bigger thing. You follow? Hezbollah has to do with the Shiites. That's a more complicated question. But you see, the Middle East is wonderfully, impossibly complicated. I know this is depressing, but we're not here to entertain. On top of all this, 2000 and 2004 saw 9/11, the reaction, the Western war against Al-Qaeda, the invasion and shattering of Iraq, the subsequent insurgency. All this drew most of the attention of the Muslims in the UK and France away from the the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, especially the insurgency. Remember the children of all those doctors from London and Paris who ran off to join the insurgency, not to fight against Israel, but to fight against the Americans in Iraq. Remember, the UK was one of the two countries that invaded Iraq. It was America and Tony Blair, America and England, as opposed, let's say, to France, who opposed the invasion. So the Muslims in France could say, oh, France is good. I wanted to talk seriously about French Jewry. Then it's now the largest community in Europe and the most physically attacked. But the hour is late, so I'll have to satisfy myself with scratching the surface as I tried to do tonight. And let's look at France next year. Good night. Next year.
I thought this is next year.
You know what I mean.
Next season.
Yeah.
Wow, that guy's pretty emphatic.
Yes, he is.
What is his position?
He's the chief rabbi of the main mosque in Jerusalem, as we would call it.
Yeah, it's scary.
Yeah.